What up, what up, what up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Let's Ask Paul, the podcast where I, Paul Abernathy, attempt to answer all of your pressing electrical questions submitted to me through the Let's Ask Paul portal over at paulabernathy.com. And we're getting a bunch of great questions that are coming in. They are getting a little bit of backlog, but I'm trying to catch them up. And of course, we want to also introduce some of the segments where we answer some of the questions of the day that have been submitted through Nika's portal and give my take on it as well. So there's so much waiting in the queue to do. But before I do that, I want to thank everybody out there for listening to the podcast, sharing it, because you obviously are sharing it. The numbers are going up. We used to do 300,000 unique downloads a month. I think we are surpassing that now. I don't know. I have to check the numbers. Brittany gives them to me, but I think we're even surpassing that now. So it's just it's an amazing thing. You know, everybody's in a video-centric world. Everything's video. And, it's almost like the audio aspect of learning has left. And for a time there where video was so popular, but I'm going to be honest with you, our podcast has been strong. The podcast is making an amazing surge. People are just listening to it, and I'm getting tons of emails where people are actually referencing the podcast in the emails. So that's cool as well. They're either yell out saying, "Hey, Paul, I love your podcast" or whatnot. So again, I hope you're learning something from it, listening it, and I do my best to try to paint the mental picture when I do a podcast. So for me, it's a challenge to be able to try to explain something in a way that, not seeing it, but being able to relate to it. So that's a goal, always a goal of mine. So hopefully I succeed with that. Hey, remember, you can listen to any of our podcasts on any of your favorite listening platforms. The number one platform by far that people listen to our podcasts on is Apple Podcast. But remember, you've got Google Podcasts, you got Deezer, iHeartRadio, you got Podbean, you got Spreaker, Spotify. Did I say Google Podcast? Okay. There anywhere that's a popular platform for listening to podcasts. I listen to all mine on Spotify, by the way. All you got to do is ask for Master the NEC podcast, MasterThenec podcast. And you can find our podcast on all of those popular listening platforms. And we appreciate you subscribing and listening and sharing it with everybody. Again, share it at the water cooler, share it on the job site, let everybody know about it. Again, it's here for you, and you can get involved by simply going to paulabernathy.com and submit your questions. It doesn't matter what the question is. I'll respond either via email, or if I want to, and it's really going to be something that'll teach other people, you may be selected for an upcoming podcast, much like today's podcast. So again, thank you everybody for participating in it and making the podcast is what it is. So it's a beautiful thing. So again, I appreciate you all, and I do appreciate all of you out there. So don't ever think that I do not. I do appreciate every one of you. All right. Today's episode is sponsored by Electrical Code Academy, your one-stop shop for all electrical code training, whether it's residential, commercial, industrial, grounding and bonding, electrical theory, or if you want our famous Fast Tracks Black or our Fast Tracks Plus program. The only difference in the Black and the Plus is the Plus gives you access to exclusive videos for 12 months, where the Black doesn't. But as far as the exam prep course and your access to Wednesday nights, they're the same. Okay, you choose whether or not you want to get additional enhanced videos and things like that. That is totally up to you. They both will achieve their goal, and that's to teach you the National Electrical Code. Okay? All right, so let's get into today's episode. So today's episode was submitted, and it says, "Hey, Paul, love the podcast." But there you go. Another person that loves the podcast. He said, "I've been listening to your podcast for quite a while now, and I recently just had an inspection where the electrical inspector rejected my transfer switch and transfer equipment because he said it did not transfer from the generator within 10 seconds. Now, this is a dwelling, and it's simply a Generac generator with an automatic transfer switch. I am switching the entire house. Does it have to switch power within 10 seconds? Thanks in advance, and I would appreciate any code references that you can give me to help fight this fight." Okay. I don't know how much of a fight. There's really no fight here. Okay. This is a case where the electrical inspector is probably came from a commercial environment and they're not really up to speed when it comes to the rules and requirements in Article 702. So you have Article 700, you have Article 701, and you have Article 702. Okay, 700 is going to be for emergency systems. It has a requirement in there that's in 700.12 to initiate transfer of the loads for emergency systems within 10 seconds, right? And then legally required is 60 seconds, okay? But when it comes to optional standby power, there is no requirement for any time frame. Realistically, it's going to transfer pretty quickly. Obviously, the way these systems are made, they're pretty robust today. They do a great job. But when it comes to optional standby, it's exactly what it is, folks. It's optional. It's not a requirement. There is 0 cases in a residential application. Again, purely residential 1 and 2 family dwellings, not multifamily buildings where there's passive egress and a jurisdiction will require possibly emergency or legally required. All we're saying here is that this is a dwelling and there is no requirement for the time for the transfer. Okay? So again, 700.12 is 10 seconds for emergency. 701.12, again, this one will be not to exceed 60 seconds. But there may be a requirement where it has to be quicker than that, depending on the loads and what's being part of that legally required. So a jurisdiction could say, it possibly could be less than 60 if that's what they want for a specific required application, but it's not to exceed 60. And then, of course, you got 702, which you are not going to find any time factors in there, right? So I know that a lot of people want to call every generator an emergency power, but that's not true. A generator, whether it's emergency in 700, whether it's part of legally required in 701, or it's part of 702 for the optional, they are standby power across the board. All of them, it is standby power. It's the significance of the fact that for emergency and legally required, your transfer switch has to be rated for emergency. Whereas in the optional, it does not. And there is no time frame at all. So emergency, legally required, have a time frame component on it to transfer. The optional has none at all. So tell your inspector he is wrong. Tell him Paul said so. If you'd like to call me, better yet, if you'd like to email me and debate me, he can always go to paulabernathy.com and submit it and say who he is and reference this episode. And hey, maybe I'll have him on air live. Maybe we can do a live broadcast or something and I can explain to him or her the code rules associated with optional standby systems. How about that? All right, so hopefully that answers your question for that one. Let's see if we have another question for today. All right, it says, greetings, Paul. I have a question about an electrical panel installed in my kitchen. It happens to be covered by a cabinet door, and it's basically in a cabinet. And on a remodel, an inspector said that it had to be changed because it is not considered accessible. Can you explain the code rules here? Appreciate your time. Okay, not a whole lot of information given here, but what I gather is, and again, I don't know if it obviously wasn't allowed or legal at the time. We don't know when it was built. We don't know when it was done. Was it compliant at the time of installation? All we know, based on that question, is it looks like somebody has an electrical panel that's in a cabinet in a kitchen, and it's got a door on it, I guess, or it's got some kind of cabinet door, or it's hidden in a cabinet. That's all I can gather from your question. Again, I do appreciate your question. But as always, I like to tell people, remember, in my submittal over on paulabernathy.com, there's more than enough room in that submittal box to be very detailed about your question. Okay? So based on what I've got, panel boards are required to be accessible. The overcurrent protected devices are required to be readily accessible. It sounds to me like this would be a violation of 110.26. So it sounds like if it's in a cabinet, you're not going to have the minimum of 30 inches for the width of the working space. Probably have cabinets or counters or shelves or whatever is probably going to be in the working space in front of that panel. I don't want to think about having to lean inside of a cabinet to work inside of a panel, okay? So, again, not enough detail, but I'm just kind of going on what I got. So it sounds to me like this would be a clear violation of 110.26. Now, you said something about remodel, I don't know the details. So if it was, let's say the cabinet, the panel was there first, then it was legal. Then somebody came in and put a cabinet over top of it. That's where the problem starts. Because, the inspection folks, they don't get to see that. They might pass originally the panel. It's kind of like a panel in the basement, and then somebody converts an area to a bathroom, and then now the panel's in a bathroom, and that's a problem, right? So, the problem's really with the overcurrent devices that's in the bathroom, by the way. But same here when it comes to the clearances and all. Is it the chicken before the egg or the egg with chicken or whatnot? But what it sounds like to me is a clear issue where if it's in a cabinet, I'm as an electrician, I don't want to climb in that cabinet to have to work on something in that panel. You know what I'm saying? And so there's a good chance you're not going to have the working space, the width. You're probably not going to have the height. Probably not going to have the depth. Well, you might have the depth if the door's open, that type of thing. But I don't think you'll meet all those elements. So I'm going to have to say to you, you might need to follow up to this episode. I believe this is episode 104 of the Let's Ask Paul. I'm not sure, but check that out when you submit a follow-up. Give me a little more details, because to me, right now, I don't know that you're meeting the minimum width, depth, and height of that required working space. So again, that's about the best answer I'm going to give you on that right there, without actually seeing it. Of course, if you want to send me a picture of it, as I tell other people, if you want to send me a picture, make sure you reference your podcast submission when you send it. All you've got to do is send it in to info at electricalcodeacademy.com and reference it as a podcast image. And I will look at it and chime in on it as well. So anyway, that's the best I can get for that one there. Hopefully that answered your question. Let's see if we've got another one in the queue that people have been dying to ask me. Okay, so this next question, right? This is an interesting question. It says, "Hey Paul, love the podcast. I recently did an install where the electrical inspector told me that I must prove to him the integrity of the circuit before he would allow me to energize the circuit. Where in the code does it require this, or is the inspector overreaching their boundaries? Thanks again, and keep up the great work." All right, good question. So this is one of those things that you got to look at and go, okay, we have to understand the role of the electrical inspector who is acting as the AHJ on behalf of the building official. And so an AHJ is a defined term in the National Electrical Code, okay? Authority having jurisdiction. Somebody has to have the final say, right? And it's kind of funny because if you're in the county in like Texas, you're out in a rural county, and you're the electrician installing it, and there's no permits required, believe it or not, you're the AHJ. You're charged with making sure that you meet the code. Why? Because, for example, the state of Texas, they're still going to hold you accountable even if there's no inspections or permitting in that county. If somebody gets hurt, something happens, then they're going to investigate it, and you're still under the honor system to make sure that you're meeting the minimum required safety standard, which is the NEC, depending on the adopted edition in your state. In Texas, it's 2020 edition of the National Electrical Code. That's what we're working off of. So you can cut corners, but ultimately you're the AHJ where there is not one. And if it all crap hits the fan, then you're the one that's going to be held responsible. So no different in a municipality where they have inspections. If the inspector has to make a ruling based on the best of their ability, and they may agree or may disagree with you, but ultimately they have the final say. Now, again, you've heard me say before, you can go over people's head. You can go over an inspector's head to the building official or their supervisor if there is a good case for an argument. Okay, I'm all for that. In fact, when I was the head of jurisdictions in Richmond or in Alexandria, Virginia, I encouraged it if you felt you had a ground to stand on and you could back it up and you had an opinion and it was based on what you thought was what the code is saying, then you needed to present that case and we would listen to your case. And there's many occasions where I would overrule an inspector. And there's no hard feelings. I mean, at least I didn't think there was, although they didn't care much for me in Alexandria anyway. But, it's not that I give a damn. But, hard feelings being what they are, I mean, it's you have a right to be heard, but the inspector has to make a decision. So the reason I say that is one of the areas where this sounds like what is happening is that the inspector is trying to invoke 110.7, which is called wire integrity. And here's what it says in the code. I'll go on and read it to you so we can kind of get into it. And then we'll look at the authority that the AHJ has. And I will tell you, the 2023 code broke down 90.4 so much better. They did such a good job in 2023 to break that out into subparts. They really did a good job with this because it's a funky read in the 2020 when it comes to 90.4. Now, we'll look at that because that kind of goes into the enforcement or with the HJ, what they have to do, whether we like it or not. 110.7 says wiring integrity. So it says completed wiring installations shall be free from short circuits, ground faults, and any connections to ground other than as required or permitted elsewhere in this code. They're charged with that. You're charged with showing that. I'm going to be honest with you. For me, you kind of met that when I went to do the inspection and all the breakers are on and flipping switches and checking receptacles. And that's about all I can give you, right? As an inspector, I'm not going to be pulling out switches. I'm not going to be pulling out receptacles. There's only so much I can look at on a rough end. The integrity, there's just only so much. So I don't know how you're supposed to demonstrate this other than to say, Mr. Inspector, see this light? It works. See this receptacle? It works. You put your tester in there, okay? No reverse polarity, okay. See the GFCIs trip? The AFCIs will function like they're supposed. That is about all I can do as inspector. So for you that sent me that question, I'm not sure what they want you to do, but that sounds like what he's trying to press. And so the real question is you need to ask him, says, what do you want me to do? I mean, I've got switches in, I've got the lights in, I've got breakers on, everything works, nothing's tripping, GFCIs aren't tripping, everything's fine. It seems to me that the wiring integrity is all good. And typically that would be acceptable. So I'm sorry you're dealing with that directly with an inspector. But and maybe it's just a communication thing. Or maybe you've done something in the past to piss him off and now he's got a chip on his shoulder, or he or she, and I don't know. You sound pretty, level-headed the way you submitted it to me, and it seems like you just want to, have a conversation with them. But that's probably what they're bringing up is 110.7, the wiring integrity. Now, 90.4, talking about enforcement, and I want to talk about that a little bit because I usually don't get that much of an opportunity. We as electricians, want to jump on inspectors all the time. And I was an inspector. I was supervisor of inspectors. I was the engineer for the city. I had to work with people. And so it was far better for me to want to get along with people. I did. I backed everything up with code. I gave you every code reference if I turned you down. So I wasn't trying to be an a-hole. I was supporting you with the proper information. And I gave you direction on how to fix things, right? Whether you liked it or not, I'm giving you that direction. But the AHJ has to make that decision. And if you're in an area that doesn't have authority of jurisdiction, then you have to make that decision, but you need to make a sound decision, okay? And when it comes to the wiring integrity, if you do everything right, you're 6 inches of free conductor, you're terminating it right, you're doing your screws right, there's only so much the inspector's going to look at, right? If everything's working, then I would assume your wiring integrity is fine. Now, where this can be a problem in attics, a lot of people will use this, for example, because they can't really stand on workmanship. So they'll say wiring integrity, depending on how you run your cables and what you do, they could argue that it was a problem with the integrity and it could cause a problem. You know, they could build a case for that or even try. And again, that's still pretty hard pressed. And I encourage inspectors out there, don't reinvent the wheel and don't try to be expectors, be inspectors. Okay. There's only so much you can do at the end of the day. Now, when it comes to enforcement 90.4, again, often overlooked. So I'm going to read it and then I'll elaborate on it. It says 90.4 enforcement. It says the code is intended to be suitable for mandatory application by governmental bodies that exercise legal jurisdiction over electrical installations. In other words, they have electrical inspection process, okay, including signaling and communication systems. So that should remind you that Chapter 8, dealing with communications, is very much under the jurisdiction of the AHJ, and they very much can use the rules in Chapter 8 to enforce communication system installations. Okay, so we got that. It says, and for use by insurance inspectors. Okay, so again, they could be using this code, which is the NEC, for the basis for any insurance claim to see whether or not something was substandard to what the NEC is, creating a violation, which could create a hazard. All those ways to get out of paying a payout to a client. I'm sure they could use this NEC. In fact, I've been expert witness for quite a few of those cases, and you'd be surprised. But they have that right to use this. It also goes on to say the authority having jurisdiction for enforcement of this code has the responsibility, okay, listen here, has the responsibility for making interpretations of the rules, okay, for deciding on the approval of equipment and materials, and for granting the special permission contemplated in a number of these rules. So they have to make the choice, whether you like it as an electrician or not. And sometimes you do get an overzealous inspector. And sometimes it's just going to have to be a conversation, have a cup of coffee, chill out or something, just have a communication. Sometimes you might have to go over their head. But ultimately, if the NEC, in itself, the NEC is really nothing more than a document, right? It has to be adopted by your state, and it has to be utilized and adopted by your jurisdiction as what's going to be used in your state. Now, once it is, then it's enforceable. And once it's enforceable, the mission is set forth to the building officials as the AHJs who oversee electrical installations in your city, in your county, or wherever you may be. And then they charge that mission to their deputies, which are their inspectors, who act on behalf of the AHJ. And they have to make these calls. Somebody's got to make it. You have to have that authority, okay? So even on a military base, for example, if they choose to use the NEC or adopt the NEC for the installation, then the base commander becomes the AHJ. And they might have inspectors for them that become deputies just like a municipality, those type of things. So if they are going to utilize the NEC, then again, they end up taking over the requirements for being, considered the AHJ. The same as I said, if you're doing work in a county that doesn't have inspections, doesn't have permitting, but you're still going to do it, but your state is still going to hold you accountable. Even in those areas where inspections are not done, you still need to meet the code as a minimum. You can always go above the code if you feel like you can, but you've got to at least meet the code as a minimum, okay? And so that's even on you whether or not you have any official capacity from somebody doing inspections or even authority. You have to, it's kind of a moral thing, okay? Now, special permission, remember, it's going to go into that when it says, next thing I'm going to read you says, by special permission, the authority having jurisdiction may waive specific requirements in this code or permit an alternative method where it is assured that equivalent objectives can be achieved by establishing and maintaining effective safety. So you got special permission where maybe there's a unique situation. You just have something that the code just doesn't cover well. That old thing that everybody says, there's a gray area here or there, right? Well, If that's what you're dealing with, then the AHJ can be your friend because they're the ones that are going to have to give you special permission. Special permission being in written terms, expressly permitting you to do something as an alternative, and it's designed to meet the equivalent objective of the minimum safety standard. And so if you come up with something and say, look, I want to do this, and it meets the same intent, and if the AHJ agrees, then they'll give you written permission to do it, and you go on your merry way, and you do the installation, and you move on. And that is a powerful thing when you have an installation where you're doing something that maybe is not adequately covered by the NEC. Maybe it's something we just haven't written in yet, or some kind of unique, weird situation, right? I can give you an example of one that's going to come in the 2023 code, whereas the peninsular receptacle requirement disappeared. So you no longer have to have receptacles in a kitchen at a peninsula or island, but you still got to bring the branch circuit there, with the intent that the receptacle has to be either in the island or peninsula or above it, not more than 20 inches. But it could be a pop-up, tombstone, whatnot, but it can't be below the counter. Now, there was supposed to be a TIA that was going out to allow it to bring back the application where you can install it below the countertop, not more than 12 inches and not under an overhang more than 6 inches. That did not pass. That failed. So effectively, the code on 2023 is going to require us to take the small appliance branch circuit to the island or peninsular, put it in a junction box, leave it there. Now, at some point, you're going to realize there was a reason why, for years, we wanted receptacles on islands and peninsulas. Okay? And so at some point, you're going to get that call as an electrician, and somebody's going to say, hey, I need you to put a receptacle in my island. And theoretically, you're going to pull a permit, you're going to go out there, inspector's going to come out there, and he's going to say, no, you got to put a little pop-up style in the counter mounted that pop up above the counter or whatever, but you can't put it below the countertop. And you go, well, we've been doing that for years. He goes, absolutely not. That's not what the code doesn't permit that anymore. Well, you might need to argue and try to get special permission. And you might say, well, no, how is that going to meet equivalent objectives and all that by putting it below? And I get it, but there's going to be a situation like, well, what do you do? Well, you're going to have to put that pop up. You're going to have to put it above the counter some way. And it's just going to cause more trouble than it's worth. So you have to work with the AHJ, and they might give you something by special permission to do something. And you're loosely going to be doing that because that's not really what it says here, because there's no way you're meeting safety equivalent. But maybe you're meeting equivalent objectives to establish and maintain effective safety, because then he could argue that, well, if you're going to put a receptacle there, putting it on the side below the counter is acceptable because putting it some other way might create another potential problem or whatnot. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out my ass there. But I'm just saying that's an example where you may run into something needing special permission, and you're going to have to finagle the words. You're going to have to finagle the argument in order to potentially get what you want to do. But the way it stands right now in the 2023, you're not going to put any receptacle on an island or peninsula below the countertop, period, at all. Never anymore. Okay? So that's just kind of one of those things. Now, it also goes on to say this code may require new products, constructions, or materials that may not yet be available at the time this code is adopted. It says, in such event, the authority having jurisdiction may permit the use of the products, constructions, or materials that comply with the most recent previous edition of this code adopted by the jurisdiction. A good example of that was years ago when we had AFCIs, and we started adding in there the requirement, AFCI receptacle outlets, the outlet type, and they weren't out yet. So, it was in the code, but they weren't out yet. And we always had the breaker style that we could utilize. But that's an example where, it's certain things that the code might demand, but they're not necessarily available yet. But yet the code tells you that you've got to do something. But in the previous edition, it did not. Another good example, I'm just throwing examples out, is when AFCIs went from being branch and feeder to combination, and you could have had a new circuit being added and a panel was existing from a manufacturer that maybe hadn't come out with a combination yet, but they had a branch and feeder. So maybe you're just going and pulled a permit and you're doing just adding some circuits, and the inspector comes out and you go, there's not one available for GE. And so what are you supposed to do? Are they going to make you redo the entire panel because of that? That wouldn't be realistic. But they do have, that manufacturer might have had a branch and feeder one available. And you go, look, they don't have it to meet the current code for this manufacturer. This is what I've got. So they might be able to go back to a previous edition where you didn't need it, or you met it with you would have been able to meet a previous edition. I'm just giving you examples, okay? Again, there's some people out there that say crappy examples, Paul. I get it. Well, when I hear your podcast, then I'll comment on it. But those are just some examples where you got to work with the AHJ because, again, there should not be there to be against you. They should be there to work with you. And I think if you set the tone early on that you're there to work together, and whether you like them or not, you better put on that happy face and make it happen. Because an inspector with that special permission in certain application, or the ability to interpret something that's in your favor, could go a long way. Okay, if you're just arguing, chances are nothing's going to go your way. I'm just saying. All right. Well, hopefully I answered that question the best that I can. That's the only examples I can think of at the moment. And if you out there don't feel they're relevant, then okay. You can always thumbs down the podcast. I don't care. We don't share those anyway, so it doesn't matter to me. Only you know you did it, and if that makes you feel good and makes you sleep at night in your hollow heart, then you do what you got to do, boo. All right? Okay. That's a pretty good episode. Covered quite a few topics on this one. So join us next time. Again, listen to our podcast. Search for Master the NEC Podcast on all your popular podcast listening platforms. Make sure you go to paulabernathy.com, submit your questions, and of course, you can listen to the podcast there as well. Also, go ahead and get our mobile app. It's Spaces by Wix. They're our partner for our mobile app. Gives you full access to a lot of the features on our website through our app. So check that out over at electricalcodeacademy.com, .net, or .org. It doesn't matter. Or you can go to necchat.com. That's necchat.com. And you can actually download the mobile app onto your phone directly from that page. All right? All right, folks. Till next time, stay safe. God bless. And we'll catch you on the next episode of Let's Ask Paul.